Krisztián asked me to read his paper here for you, which is a big honor for me, and I hope I can do justice to his work. So, with the emerging documentation techniques such as digital photography and more recently photogrammetry, it is finally possible to accurately record every inch on any surface at a microgranular level. Therefore, today, most epigraphic practices are designed to provide the necessary synthesis of decorative elements rather than aiming for a faithful representation of the original context, including its paint scheme. In this lecture, I'd like to revisit the concept of color documentation to offer several methods, each answering various data-driven problems related to how we perceive and translate ancient Egyptian painted remains. I would like to start with the most common case, documenting wall scenes, where the painted details and the original hues are relatively well preserved. For example, there was no need to include color information with the drawings created for TT65, the beautiful Ramesses private tomb of Imiseba, because color photography could fulfill this role. Instead, epigraphic documentation aimed to faithfully represent the painted outlines while eliminating interrupting elements such as damaged areas and soot to understand the decorative program better. Nevertheless, color was the main characteristic element of Imiseba's tomb, indicating color was still considered to have a prominent role in the epigraphic representation. To keep this integration simple and elegant, the Imiseba method developed a system that reinterpreted wall paintings to attribute each basic color with a dotted grayscale pattern, only distinguishing between light and dark elements of the composition. This technique provided a much better visual understanding of the overall configuration over the limiting line drawing, allowing fine details to be fully appreciated. Although very effective and well manageable on small areas, applying this color code one dot at a time over larger painted surfaces became time-consuming and problematic in the long term. As a resolution, with recent evolution of computer technology, the Imiseba method was digitally resurrected, blending traditional and digital practices while enhancing the original concept. For documenting yet another painted tomb, TT179, a large panel with each of the original color code layouts was created manually on paper, then scanned and multiplied to provide an infinite digital pattern that could be applied over extended surfaces as a simple brushstroke. Computer-generated patterns and individual hand-drawn dots indicated small details and sensitive areas. The key element of this method was that the pattern, being based on a hand-drawn texture, became virtually indistinguishable from its manually color-coded predecessors. The difference is immediately noticeable when we compare the color photograph taken in TT179 with the final drawings because of the reduced color palette and the simplified color values. In both tombs, each color-coded panel received a homogeneous pattern referring to their original hues instead of the highly variable tone to be seen on the walls today. For example, dark hues tending to lose their ancient values were represented as black or dark blue, if traces of the original could be determined with certainty. This decision deeply affected the final appearance of both tombs' final drawings, providing a very different type of visual documentation than a photograph could ever deliver. One of the great advantages of working digitally is the ability to indicate the relationship between fine details and the whole by treating fragments as part of a larger context. When creating a hypothetical reconstruction for a loose painted fragment group depicting the so-called Abydos pilgrimage, color coding was used as the main distinguisher between existing and reconstructed portions of the wall. This solution becomes even more rewarding as we start zooming out and absorbing the entire wall as a single compositional unit. While the line drawing identifies the main elements of the scene, providing essential information on a macro level, ultimately, color makes these details function as an integral part of the composition. Any visual interpretation would have been deducted from the original appearance of these wall scenes, regardless of the documentation technique. For some purposes, the drawing must simplify the original, thus focusing on the important details. At the same time, this kind of selection is considered undesirable in other cases, leading to a preference for using photography to achieve objectivity. In TT 179, a color-coded grayscale line drawing was used hand-in-hand with color photography to provide the maximum amount of information. Nonetheless, we can't make universal assumptions for color representation based exclusively on well-preserved examples. So, what happens when color details are not that well preserved? In Abydos, a rather different approach was utilized for documenting paint to indicate faded pigment that was still detectable on the surface. Many of the objects retained from the settlement site at the mortuary complex of Saint-Lucer-de-Sert appeared to be fragile, with most of their painted details being imperceptible to the naked eye. Needless to say, the color code system, with its homogeneous grayscale panels developed for tombs, failed to properly indicate the sporadic traces, further complicated by the lack of definite outlines. As a resolution, a more appropriate grayscale texturing technique was invented, enhancing the remaining pigment traces while eliminating most of the background noise at the same time. This technique, chosen to represent the graphical impression of painted details, was a radical step away from the traditional outline drawing representation. Every little pigment spot had to be reinforced over the photo by adding a pencil texture with variable strengths, slowly forming a textural impression of the paintings. When working at Luxor Temple, an updated version of the same cross-hatched texture captured the faint pigment traces of the late Roman murals in the imperial cult chamber. Weighed down by the same limitations of freehand color coding proposed by the Abydos method, although very effective, it became rather time-consuming to extend over entire wall segments. Therefore, once again, the recent evolvement of computer technology was taken advantage of in the process. When we look at the frescoes, the situation is very similar to objects found in Abydos. We can see that most of the top layer containing the details is gone. Only paint scars are often preserved, with minimal pigment remaining on the surface. In some instances, these traces do not even form recognizable features, so once again, the main goal of epigraphic recording could only be to isolate the visible pigment and present a visual synthesis of the data detectable on the surface. Looking at the results, one can easily get absorbed by the immense amount of color data represented in these drawings, even with the added simplification of the grayscale color scheme. To apply texturing over 10 meters long walls, a new digital inking method had to be developed. Initially, penciled on printed photographs, the pigment texture became the medium tone layer in the final presentation. This layer was later redrawn stroke by stroke using a tilt-sensitive Photoshop brush specifically created for this application. To show the stylistic differences between Roman paintings and pharaonic art, 2 more paint-specific layers were introduced to emphasize perspective and depth. All 3 layers operated with the same texture style, but their opacity varied according to their importance. In this way, the epigrapher could paint with the same solid black brush over the entire canvas and still produce a drawing with gray brushstrokes of variable shades. The result became a graphic impression of the original mural with a close resemblance to the late Roman painter's style, indicating even the least prominent individual brushstrokes on the eroded surface while eliminating much of the background noise that is an inseparable feature of the photograph. Although treating their material slightly differently, all these projects dealt with color by replacing the original hues with a simplified system, trusting color photography to capture the actual color values. But what happens when there is almost nothing left to photograph? What happens when color traces are so sporadic and faint that no digital photo enhancement can make sense of the data they represent? First, I would like to show you a small heart amulet drawn using a set of Derwent color pencils. When documenting small objects in Abydos, I started experimenting with a method that would allow me to indicate extreme details of precious stones selectively, expanding on the more objective approach of color photography. I found that good results could be obtained by creating enhanced colored pencil drawings on transparent film. The color pencils enabled the reproduction of fine painted lines, even at scale. The original tones could be represented accurately by building up each color from several pencil hues, thus capturing the color traditions needed to replicate the original faithfully. Working on certain weathered Abydos wall fragments from the Osiris temple, I tried the same method to indicate color details over black and white facsimile line drawings of the same scenes used as my background. A crosshatch texture mixing selected hues indicated large color panels, complementing the individual color pencil lines applied to record the fine paint lines. This mix of techniques reflected the ancient Egyptian painting procedure, wherein large color panels were set down first and fine details were added later, often working with different color palettes. Moreover, this flexible texturing technique allowed well-preserved areas to be emphasized while making less definite suggestions in poorly preserved sections. Once the color pencil drawings on matte acetate had been completed, the sheets were scanned at high resolution, color corrected and layered over the scanned line drawings. Once again, this proven technique awaited the right project to be taken much further. The temple of Amun-Jeserset at Medinet Habu, extensively modified throughout its long history, shows many stages of inscribed decoration. The Chicago house method shows relief and inscription with great precision. Yet, the traditional facsimile line drawing presents significant limitations for recording the painted decoration that originally served as the final surface of these inscribed walls. The dotted lines employed by the survey to indicate painted features suggest the basic outline or pattern, but lack the subtlety needed to capture the many fine details of the original painted finish. Another complicating factor is that the painted decoration underwent several iconographical stages of modification over time, the evidence of these being well preserved in many places on the ambulatory and facade of the 18th dynasty temple. A preliminary examination of the painted layers on scenes in the ambulatory and the temple's exterior revealed 3 separate, well-distinguished paint episodes. First, the original Tutmosid decoration, then the painted scheme associated with the Ramessid additions on the outer walls, and later a thorough Ptolemaic modification of many of the surfaces, particularly on the outside walls. Applying the Abydos color texturing technique over these paint traces helped tremendously in visualizing, contextualizing, and separating the color information of each of these stages. The following representations illustrate the color pencil technique on 3 painted pillar faces. The first is a typical example of the 18th dynasty raised relief with painted polychrome decoration on the inner pillar faces of the ambulatory. One of the sunk relief lateral pillar faces with monochrome yellow figures and signs on a white background is illustrated in the middle. Finally, there is a third stage consisting of the Ptolemaic polychrome color scheme applied over the unmodified 18th dynasty carving, obscuring its original yellow and white painted decoration, appearing on the pillars of the facade. Naturally, the applied method is intended to represent the actual state of the pigments as they are preserved on the surface vis-à-vis the carved relief. Furthermore, ultimately, to integrate these visual enhanced drawings into the larger architectural context while imitating the original appearance of the temple. It is also important to emphasize that all the colors and details included in this facsimile were in fact preserved on the wall itself. Therefore, these color impressions were not reconstructions by any means. Finally, I would like to address the problem of representing multiple painted layers in a facsimile drawing, as no comparable convention exists for indicating such a situation in the Chicago house method. As recording the scenes and texts in this section of the monument proceeded, it became apparent that enhanced techniques of recording and presenting this additional category of information would need to be developed. A particularly interesting pillar face in the ambulatory shows Thutmose III receiving life from Amun. Here, a close look at the face of the post-Amarna Amun shows a further modification applied entirely in paint. At a certain point, the god's brownish-red post-Amarna skin tone was painted over in yellow, perhaps to suggest gold. Investigation of the rest of the figure reveals yellow paint traces over the arms and legs, suggesting a wholesale modification of the color scheme for the deity. The second pillar south of the doorway on the east row shows even more prominently the yellow pigment applied over the earlier red paint on not just Amun's figure, but also on the king. When comparing this scene with another well-preserved pillar scene on the south side, it can be seen that the image of Amun in the latter shows only post-Amarna style painted elements. These later alterations amount to a complete redesign of the main figure's costumes and regalia, showing the dramatic character of these changes, which were, in this case, limited to the two principal figures. A comprehensive examination of the other interior pillar faces in the ambulatory showed that this distinctive paint alteration was applied to certain scenes, but not to others. One of these pillar scenes, however, bears some important additional information. The scene depicts the king wearing not the triangular kilt, but the tight-fitting kilt with wide beaded sporran, and the mace depicted in the other examples was omitted when this scene was carved. During this later paint modification, however, uniformity was imposed by changing the design of the king's costume. The outline of the triangular kilt was painted over the original straight garment, and the king's mace was painted in. As a result of this transformation, the visitor entering the ambulatory was greeted with 6 stylistically identical scenes, with the king in the triangular kilt protecting the entrance to the Berghain. The other pillar scenes on the north and south aisles, not visible from this axis, were not included in this painting stage. Any additional paint changes that may have been made along the central axis at this time were lost when the Berghein's doorway, east exterior and interior, were recarved during the Ptolemaic period. Inspecting the temple's exterior revealed additional traces of this paint layer, particularly on the east facade. Here, the 6 pillar faces, originally painted with yellow details on a white background, show several subsequent modifications, among which many could be ascribed to the phase in question. The best preserved examples showed faint red painted outlines around the main figure's torso, evidently rendered before the comprehensive Ptolemaic paint revision. While these lines were carefully extracted around the facial profiles, elsewhere, such as on the hands and feet, they appear hastily executed and perhaps unfinished. Interestingly, the hieroglyphic text and other features above the figures were not included in this modification stage, in conjunction with the corresponding modifications added to the ambulatory's 6 eastern interior pillar scenes. The effectiveness of the enhanced color drawings allowed the historical evolution of the paint schemes on the 6-pillared facade of the small temple to be shown with a sequence of color representations, indicating the main stages of paint additions and modifications. Again, a digital version of the color drawing method was developed to apply the same technique over much larger surfaces. Color texture patterns were created from the original penciled samples, and digital color pencil brushes were designed and tested in the field. As a time-saving measure, these techniques were applied over large homogeneous painted areas, such as torus moldings, cavetto cornices, or deep-cut ramessid hieroglyphs. The manual and digital brushstrokes complement one another and blend seamlessly on the digital canvas, permitting the desired level of quality while providing greater control and efficiency in the process. In addition, another version of the panel was created for each phase, with the digital color photograph layered into the background, illustrating further the 3-dimensional character of the inscribed elements. 4 main stages were illustrated with this method: the 18th dynasty phase, the Ramessid editions, the 21st dynasty editions, and finally the Ptolemaic redesign of the entire color scheme. The resulting color representations show the temple facade as if it had been left unmodified after a given period, and gradually decayed to the point of showing the currently visible damage and paint traces. Nonetheless, the hunt for hidden paint traces is far from over, as traces of this paint episode are also found on the temple's outer walls, atop the original Ramses III painting, and underneath the Ptolemaic layer. For these much more extensive surfaces to be explored, as has been the case in all my previous examples, a digital equivalent of the color pencil texturing was developed, considering my decades-old Derwent technique and bringing it on par with today's possibilities regarding digital documentation. Visual documentation as a record-keeping process is never objective. On the contrary, it should be regarded as a highly subjective process, and its success largely depends on one's knowledge of the source material. Indeed, we must always be careful when it comes to any restoration to take it only for what it is, someone else's idea of what the artifact would have originally looked like. Thank you.